Well, hello. I'm making this video because I just bought an NVG30 unit and I wanted to share my thoughts on it. And I'm doing this from maybe a different perspective than I've seen so far on YouTube. So a little bit of background. I purchased a PVS-14 Gen 3 white phosphor tube a few years back. Pretty good spec unit. The FOM was like 2200 or something like that. Don't remember all the other specs, but decent tube I should say. And had a good time with it. I did a lot of mountain hiking, did some night hunting, and did some running and gunning with it, as well as just like jogging, stuff like that at night. I live in a pretty mountainous area, so there's a lot of rocks and areas with dense foliage that I need to be able to navigate through. And I was able to do that fairly well with just a binocular. However, after a few years of having this thing, I wanted to reallocate some of that budget into another area. Now, I had thought about digital night vision before getting my PVS-14, but everything I had ever heard about it led me to believe that it was going to be just a waste of money. You have things like the Psionics Aurora or the Psionics Opsin, the Night Fox Pearl, and while they were interesting, they all seem to have some major drawback. The major one being latency and the nausea and just lack of ability to see what you're doing that comes with that. The other one was that most of these units, people were saying you really needed to run with infrared light on if you're going to actually see something. Although, I'll get into this in a little bit, but I don't think that's as much of a big deal as people on Reddit or YouTube like to make it out to be. Unless you're out there with other people who have night vision actively hunting you, doesn't matter if you're blasting IR light. So yes, it's cool to have something that intensifies light well enough that you don't need supplemental IR, but honestly, depending on what you're doing, you might be using supplemental IR with an actual analog tube anyway. My friends and I would go out on some hikes and you get foggy nights or you're just in really dense foliage and you need supplemental IR to see. Now, obviously, if somebody was hunting me and they had night vision, then I might behave a little different and just accept that I'm going to have to move a lot slower. But that's not the case for most of us. And seeing as this is primarily something that we're doing as a hobby, we shouldn't kid ourselves, even if we have other ideas for what we might use it for if we needed to. It's probably going to be for hobby use 99% of the time. So anyway, leading up to that, that's all my background on night vision. And eventually I started seeing stuff come up online about the NVG30s. And I was curious because they seemed like they had better illumination and less issues with latency. So I went ahead and I actually sold my analog unit and I purchased this guy over here, NVG30. So this is not going to be a full review. There's people on YouTube who've got videos partnering with good night gear and manufacturers of the NVG30 that talk about this unit, its specs, and the product itself in much more detail. I'm not trying to do that. What I am trying to do is share my thoughts as someone who was a prior analog user who went backwards to digital and how I think they compare, because I don't see a lot of that online. And I think that it could be good for people who maybe don't have the budget to drop, $3 or $4 grand on an analog unit, but are interested in having some sort of night vision capability. All right, so I'll just give you some first impressions because I've only had this thing for a couple of weeks, have taken it out, but obviously with more time and experience, I might have some opinions that'll change or just other things that'll stand out to me. So for one, the image quality is pretty good. So like I said, prior to this, I had some Gen 3 2200 FOM-ish tubes, and I could make out details a reasonable distance away, but I was pleasantly surprised by this thing. I can actually read things from 100 yards away, depending on the size of the text, but at least like a stop sign or something. So pleased with the image quality. Another thing that I wasn't expecting to like so much, but I do, is the digital zoom. Now, obviously it's a digital zoom, so you're losing image quality, or the image quality is going to stay the same the more you zoom in on it. all it's going to do is make your digital picture larger. But that's still helpful. And up to 3 times zoom, I think this is actually pretty practical for identifying things, whether you're night hunting or just whatever, out on a hike, or let's say you were going to try to engage something, maybe something humanoid, and you wanted to be certain it was what you thought it was. The digital zoom is actually pretty helpful for that. Obviously, if you go further, it has 4 times. It's super grainy, but hey, at least you get the everything else. So that kind of leads into the next thing, which is that I know a lot of people rag on passive aiming and they say it's useless, but also a lot of people don't have a grand or more to drop on a laser aiming module. So passive aiming is good in the sense that if you have a quality red dot, you can passive aim. You also don't need to go out and drop another grand or more on something to do active aiming. So passive aiming with this thing was pretty good, and being able to passive aim with built-in zoom on the digital unit was actually very helpful. If I was hunting and I was stationary, I would definitely use this to take shots. All right, let's see what else we got here. I'm working off my notes so I don't get on too many rabbit trails. I didn't notice any issues with latency on 40 FPS. There are issues, I would say, still with latency. I'll get into that later. But as far as walking around and not being able to see things or just getting nauseous, no issues there. Intensification. I did not need to run my supplemental IR walking around until I got into darker areas. Now, I did notice a difference in intensification. I went in the basement of my house at night, and I know that with my analog unit, I wouldn't have had to turn on supplemental IR, but I did with this unit. However, even though I wouldn't have needed supplemental IR to see with my analog unit, I probably would have used it because I could barely see without it. So that's just a contrast there. I'm sure on a dark night, again, dense foliage, you wouldn't be able to see that much, but depending on what you're dealing with for an analog unit, you might not be able to either. Concerns about tube damage. So there are none, because you're not dealing with an actual image intensifier. There's no green phosphor or white phosphor image intensifier inside of this thing. It's all just digitally done. So you can look at the sun or you can look at the moon, you can have this thing on during the day, and you're not going to burn your tubes because there really are no tubes to burn. So that's a plus. Now, 2 major areas that I saw the greatest decrease in performance compared to my analog unit. Number 1 was I hate this mount, which there's a lot of aftermarket Chinese knockoff mounts you can buy to fix this problem. But aside from the fact that it's got like 3 points of articulation that's just secure with these tension screws that never tighten down quite as much as I wish they would, it also, when I brought it in close enough to my face, it was like at a steep downward angle because of the way I had to rotate in. So to look at anything above the horizon, I had to really crane my neck up, and that gets uncomfortable after a while. So I don't love this mount, but my replacement is on the way. So we'll see how I like that. Last thing, and I would say this is the biggest drawback, is actually trying to move at a decent pace with this. I think part of that comes from the fact that you're looking at a square display, and it's supposed to have a 40-degree field of view, but just not being able to see a little further down in comparison to where I had the monocular on my face. Compared to my analog unit, I thought that was a drawback. Some of those corners that you would have with a circular view, I really felt that I was missing those, and that affected my depth perception and ability to just not trip over things at my feet. The other bigger issue, though, is I used to go, like I said, on jogs with my PVS 14, and I really had no issues. With this thing, as soon as you start moving, the screen is just too blurry if you're going in anything more than like a fast walk. If you're going to try to sprint or jog or anything like that, it does blur out quite a bit. And that doesn't mean that you can't see anything at all. It just means that it's very disorienting, and it's certainly much worse than an analog unit. So yeah, those are just some initial thoughts. I'll run it some more. I'll try it with my other mount. I'm going to get some better supplemental IR than the cheap Amazon flash that I have on it right now. And we'll see what I think after that. But I just want to get this out here because I think, it's good to have perspective from different angles. And for me, going from analog to digital, I would say this thing gives me like 70% of the value that I want as far as hunting and going on walks at night. Running and gunning and being able to effectively move over rough terrain, that's where you're going to see the major drawbacks, in my opinion. But for under $400, I think it's worth it. And it's probably going to be something that a lot more people can afford compared to saving up, $3-4 grand or more for an analog unit. So I also think that the more people get into this, the more the technology is going to improve. It is improving fast. So I hope that within a couple of years, some of those issues with the movement and the latency that are still there in the background will just be resolved altogether. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I'll make some more videos once I get some more time in this thing, but I just wanted to give some upfront impressions.